In this video I'm going to try to break my trainer, practice my climbing, and also finally reach my breaking point.
Anymore.
This is the last video of the SISU Tour series, stages 6 and 7, and I can honestly say I don't remember ever digging that deep. Before stage 6 I was 11th in the sprint championship, and my big goal for the final week was quite obviously reaching the top 10. But as you probably know by now, there was a heavy competition. Stage 6 was brutal on paper, 2 laps of Petit Dolor course in France, which including the lead-in meant 3 ascents of the Petit KOM. Painful course for those going for the general classification, but fairly simple for me. As usual, going for the sprint, all that mattered to me was that one and only sprint segment before the first climb. And honestly, it went about as perfectly as it could have. The pace on the start was still very fast, but since this was a long and hard course, it wasn't as insane as in stage 5. As a result, I could have conserved some energy to really unleash it on the segment. This was my second best 5-second sprint ever when it comes to raw power output, but thanks to my weight loss, for the first time in my life I've seen figures well over 15 watts per kilo. What followed next was quite predictable. I held onto the front group until the start of the climb, after which I was promptly dropped. I'm not going to bore you with what has happened in the middle of this race because nothing really happened, but at least in the final climb I clinged onto one group and practiced my climbing a little bit. So after stage 6 I moved one spot to 10th place in the sprint championship, and the only remaining question mark was whether or not I would be able to keep it that way in stage 7, the one on Champs-Élysées. Relatively easy course in itself, but this time we would do 5 laps of it. But this time I would not slack through the course once I was done with the sprint, oh no. This is one of my favorite courses in the game, and since this was the final stage, I told myself I'm going to race this one. Not just to sprint and finish, but to finish as well as possible. But the sprint segment was still my primary objective, and on this course it is not an easy one because it starts shortly before the top of the uphill part of the course. And you can probably imagine how pleasurable a group of highly motivated A+ riders can make that climb. Oh, and I forgot to tell you one thing. I've got a new rocker plate before this race. One that moves like crazy, not only from side to side, but also from front to back. And I had no idea if and how that's going to impact my sprint. And I also made 2 mistakes. After crossing the lap banner, I received a feather power-up which was immensely helpful, but unfortunately I miscalculated and used it way too soon and didn't have it for the sprint anymore. Secondly, what I do before each sprint is I go into higher gears to prepare myself. But here I didn't consider we were on an uphill and I had way too hard gear selected to start the sprint, which in combination with me not being used to the rocker plate probably caused my sprint wasn't the best I could have done. Be that as it may, it wasn't a complete disaster. I still managed to beat most of the riders and finish the sprint on the 5th spot. But this time it didn't mean the end of the race as usual, because I had my other mission, to race this entire course. And let me tell you, I had to muster all my strength to not get dropped immediately afterwards. The effort level was insane and my heart rate was already over 95% of my max. But thankfully, right after the Arc de Triomphe is this little descent which allows you to rest at least a little bit. And after the descent, I was still riding with the front guys, which was fairly surprising to me, but it got me thinking. Maybe I could try to do the sprint for the second time and have better result. And I even got a feather power-up that I would now use correctly. Well, that plan went out of the window as soon as we hit the incline. I very quickly found myself dangling off the back of the group, and it was clear I was going to be lucky to reach the banner in a group, let alone compete. I still tried to do something when we reached the segment, but after 2 or 3 pedal strokes it was clear to me I have no chance repeating my effort from the first lap.
I'm too pre-tired for that.
And after reaching the top, it was pure survival mode. I was doing about 5 watts per kilo and still was getting dropped like if I stopped pedaling. I didn't want to give up though. You can see I'm still within the touching distance, but my heart rate is very close to my max now. I popped the anvil on the descent, tried to do a few more increases in power to stay in touch, but then my body basically gave up for me.
Anymore.
The good news is the group in front of me wasn't doing that much better either. They were also clearly hurting and splitting from the A riders, which meant that they were not going particularly fast either. And I saw that when I reached Place de la Concorde. And although the last thing I wanted to do at this point was to increase the power back up, I promised at the start that I would raise this until I couldn't go anymore, so I made a surge to bridge the gap. So at this point I had another group to ride with, and the only remaining thing I needed to do right now was to survive 3 more laps. There are 2 points on this course where attacks and splits can happen. The first one is obviously the uphill section, but the second is this little exit from the tunnel. Take a look how quickly the group starts steering up here. You really need to increase the effort to stay compact. On the third lap banner I got draft power up, and thank God for that. Even before the start of the uphill section I was dangling off the back again, so I decided I wouldn't risk anything and I used the power up to get back in touch. Which meant I didn't have any help on the climb. Obviously the sprint was no longer relevant, but I really had to dig deep to not lose contact once again. And I didn't, but what came next was the first section of this race for me. I got a very sharp pain in my stomach, also known as side stitches, first on the left side, then moving to the front and to the right. Not only they made the ride very uncomfortable for me, but they were also restricting my breathing. I could do only very quick shallow breaths, and that is not sufficient for intensity like this. Thankfully the group was merciful on the downhill and I was able to stay with them even despite doing very measly effort. And I'm extremely happy that was the case, because just as quickly as the side stitches came, they went away and it was time for 2 more laps. The uphill was still very rough, but this time it looked to me others didn't like it anymore as well, and I was able to survive it fairly easily. And once again, recovery on the downhill and a surge from the tunnel exit. But this time it looked like I might be actually able to fight the final lap in a group that was mix of A riders and high B riders, which is something that I wouldn't have been able to do a few months ago. One last uphill, after which I very reluctantly used my draft power up. I knew I would be missing that one in the final sprint, but once again I felt I was in danger of being dropped. Then the last downhill recovery, and I knew at this point I would make it in this bunch. I fully expected this ride to rip wide open after the tunnel, so I tried to gain momentum on the downhill part. I saw Steven at the front, which gave me a little bit of an extra motivation to push, and on the right hand turn to the finish line, I made just another mistake. I increased my effort a second or two too late, which meant a gap opened for a brief amount of time, and even though my sprint after that was very decent, it wasn't enough to beat this group. But in the end I finished on 43rd place overall and in a group of really good riders, so considering how this race went, I think I can be very happy with this one. And what about the sprint classification, the thing that I was fighting for all 7 stages? Well, in the top 10 of the Sprint Championship there were 9 A and A+ riders with racing scores sometimes very close to 1000, and then me. I finished on 9th place in the A category out of 48 A riders who finished all 7 stages, a huge success for me. Big thanks to SISU team for organizing this amazing event. Hope you like this video and this whole series, and if you haven't seen the previous videos, click here right now.